Please welcome Chief Executive Officer, Fortune Media USA Corporation, Alan Murray.
Hi, good afternoon. Wow, I can't believe this many people are here in the auditorium and it's almost 5 o'clock. That's a Dreamforce moment. Thank you for doing this. This is going to be the best. I'm glad you did it because this is going to be the best discussion that you've heard all day. And I know that because the three people we're going to be talking to are three of the smartest people in the business. And what I'd like to do is just introduce them and bring them out on stage right now. And first of all, Dame Vivian Hunt with Mckinsey and Company. Vivian, why don't you sit right here? MediaLink CEO, Michael Kassan. Michael. And the CEO of Red Hat, Jim Whitehurst. Jim. So thank you, all three of you, for taking the time to do this. The title of the panel is The Future of Digital Transformation. I think everyone now knows that virtually any company of any size has to go through this. They are all digital companies. They need to go through a transformation. They need to have a digital strategy. But some people do it better than other people. And so, Vivian, if I can start with you. In your experience, what distinguishes a successful company from one that's unsuccessful at this?
I think you're right that the penny of incrementalism, doing tech and scaling it, doing it on the side, having some applications at work, having two-speed businesses, that era is most definitely gone. There is not, Jim will be able to speak to this in his own experience, but there's no company, large or small, startup or incumbent, that doesn't believe that. But we see a 5x difference in revenue growth between the digital transformations that are successful and the ones that aren't.
5x. So 5x. It matters in a big way.
It matters in a huge way. And the markers, I think, of success are, one, that the application of digitized technologies and AI is genuinely on strategic levers in the business. You would be surprised at the number of clients that we have who come to us who've not yet really thought from a value chain and market architecture perspective, what is it I'm trying to unlock here? What solution and value pool with the consumer? What solution on restructuring of the value chain? What's my participation in that? That's plain old strategy. But doing it with digital can sometimes be complicating and confusing. So the value proposition, it sounds like a silly and obvious thing to say, but a lot of companies aren't clear.
Know what you're doing. You're not just doing digital, you're doing something, and digital is
strategic in the market, but you've got a lot of complexity around that. One is the rate of digitization and digital application and AI varies by industry. The scale of it varies. There are some parts like the payments or retail and financial services that are moving faster than other parts of that same industry. And finally, the competitive structure, because you may need to partner or work with competitors until you compete. So the strategic footprint, clarity about that is the first thing I'd say. The second area where we see differences between winners and losers is really all about capabilities, understanding the talent that you need, and how to manage that effectively and well, particularly your talent within technology, but also embedding technology capability across other parts of your business. How do you manage agile teams? We had a client that literally had their product engineering and creation, innovation in one area, the scale up and piloting in one part, testing in another, and then feedback in another. And are we surprised that an actually brilliant idea didn't work?
Didn't happen.
Super expensive and didn't work. So lots around capabilities, lots around agility is the second category, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. And then the third and final area has a lot to do with the culture. Trying to operate a new company and a new system with the old cultural norms is proving difficult for many companies, and we can come back and talk about it.
We should definitely dive into all three of those. Michael, you've had a lot of experience with a lot of companies. What distinguishes the successful from the unsuccessful?
Well, let me look at it through the lens that we tend to look at MediaLink, and it's something that actually started in work we did with Salesforce many years ago as the Marketing Cloud was launched. What we saw was those companies that were bringing together their marketing disciplines with their IT disciplines, and where you said, the person with the pocket square and the person with the pocket protector are now becoming one and the same. and we saw that happening, and we saw that mashup, and that technology mashup was important because what we were finding is marketing folks were making more technology decisions than ever before, and technology folks were having to make more marketing decisions.
Isn't it true of virtually every function in the company?
It is
they're
now,
all,
but
they're all becoming
the silos existed, more in a more market fashion before, and so we're finding in terms of those companies that have been successful, those two things. You said they need to know where they're going. I'm a big believer if you don't know where you're going, you're going to end up somewhere else. And so if you start with that premise, and then you also look at the talent, and as you need to bring the talent together, that's where we're seeing the successful applications of this transformation journey.
Yeah. Jim, I want to dig a little bit deeper into this culture question, which I know is something you've spent a lot of time thinking about, because I found in my experience over the last 5 years or so, having groups of executives around a table doing roundtable discussions about technology, and every time, almost invariably, you get about 15 minutes into the discussion and you discover you're not talking about technology anymore. You're talking about culture. You're talking about how do I get my organization to go where I want it to go? How do I get middle managers to accept the fact they're going to be doing things in a completely different way from the way they've done it for the last 30 years? How do you build the kind of culture that can make this happen successfully?
Yeah, that really is so important. I think you got to tease out culture a little bit, because culture is an output and a reinforcer of the leadership traits and management system that you've built. And I almost dislike the word digital transformation because people focus on digital, so they assume it has something to do with technology. And it does, but fundamentally what digital transformation is doing is it's changing the work content. So the work that's left, if it hadn't been automated, requires creativity and judgment. And it requires a much faster pace of operation in a much more ambiguous environment. So when you back up and you say, how do I construct an organization to be successful when there is rapid change, when I have generally relatively educated worldly people who are having to do routine up through, or non-routine up through creative tasks, with broadband information in your pocket, how you manage and lead and inspire and get people to do that obviously looks very different than an industrial world where you had uneducated people doing rote tasks in a static environment. And so it's less about the application of technology versus recognizing how you lead, and the ultimate culture that comes out of that needs to be fundamentally different if your objective is to solve a complex problem or build agility or resilience in an organization versus, how do I take the last half a cent out of building this widget? And I think too many leaders sit here and say, I've applied these technologies, and then I'll say, do the cop-out. Well, it didn't work because my culture is wrong. Well, you're the leader. You define the culture. So how are you leading? How are you setting the context? How are you creating the context for people to do their best work? And that's up to a leader, and that ultimately is culture. But again, culture is the cop-out answer. It is culture, but leaders are responsible for building, maintaining, or changing those cultures.
And I know we only have a short amount of time here on this stage today, but can you give just a couple of starting points for how you, as a leader, build that culture?
So I think if you break down what leaders normally do in a traditional world, I'll try to do this quickly, it's you figure out what you want to do, right? So you kind of define a direction, you then tell people how to go do it, and then you hold them accountable for doing that, right? And so it's about defining, then kind of driving compliance, then putting that into initiatives and driving compliance. And the problem is, in the old days, and the problem is, in a more ambiguous world, laying out an initiative that goes out 2 or 3 years probably doesn't work. If you can specify it enough to really define it for people, you can automate it. So you shouldn't be asking people to do it anyway, you should automate it. And then how do you hold people accountable against a plan that's ambiguous by nature? So the role of a leader needs to start off, rather than think about planning as what are the initiatives I'm gonna go do, you have to start saying, how am I configuring my organization to be successful in a wide range of outcomes? So don't think about, kind of planning in a traditional, how do I plan? Think in terms of configuring. Then instead of thinking about directive, here's now what I'm going to tell people to go do, it's how do I enable people? So how do I think about data? How do I think about the appropriate culture so the right conversations happen? And then execution's less about coordination and driving compliance and much more about literally engaging to think about how you course correct and make sure that the culture stays on track. So rather than kind of this plan, direct, drive compliance, it becomes much more about configuring, enable, and engaging. And leaders need to think about that.
Fascinating. Go ahead. You wanted to.
No, but it's a much more fluid set of leadership skills, and it can be developed, taught, and scaled. It's working in a much more agile leadership practice, but it's a very different practice to what most managers and leaders are doing today. And so in a sense, if you were at the session earlier today about Obama, he talked about leaders leading groups of leaders. And that notion applies here because what you have to have is the thoughtfulness and the insight and the skills to be able to train your teams how to work and lead and manage in a much more iterative and outcome-based way. We do think that there are some bridge steps, if you take a traditionally management mindset and moving it forward. One is a radical focus on customer or some kind of market outcome. And you traditionally think of this in marketing-led organizations, consumer organizations, et cetera. But the consumer exists in every business, really bringing that to life and making that not just a slogan, but a radical focus. That is a characteristic of every single successful digital transformation we see.
And why I've heard that from a number of people that customer-centric organization is so critical to your success in this. But why hasn't that always been true?
Well, can I just actually disagree with that?
Come on.
Really?
So I think the vast majority of the time it centers around customer. What I would argue more broadly about, it has to center on a mission that is broader than the profitability of the company. And that often centers on customer and customer success. So I'll pick Red Hat as an example. We do think a lot about customers and success, but our core purpose and mission is around open source and making technology open and available, transforming the way technology is developed and consumed. And that ultimately is good for customers. But I do think the simple reason on whether it's customer or whether it is a core purpose that people can rally around is, again, if you said all the specifiable tasks have been automated, you're asking people every day to apply judgment to what they are doing. And if you don't have a true north in there for how they're applying judgment, typically the customer, but I could argue it can be other true norths, then what are they supposed to do? I mean, use a really simple example, ATM machines at a bank. Now with ATM machines, the transactional things that someone might do with a teller, they're doing it at an ATM or on the web. So if you're going into a bank to talk to a teller, you have a problem and you need an interaction. And the culture and the true north that you have set in terms of, are you trying to drive efficiency, so low cost, or are you trying to have a deep touch relationship, or whatever that true north is for that company needs to guide what that individual does. Because again, if you could lay it out in rules, put it in robotic process automation and get the person out.
We could agree or disagree, but unless you're a philanthropic organization, you're ultimately doing whatever that true north is for the customer. So it's the concept of 20 years ago when people started talking about monetization as a new thing. I remember somebody saying, gee, I thought that was what you always went into business for, was for monetization. Why is that a new affectation? So I think you're always doing it for the customer, but what I was hearing as a constant here is really it's about the talent. It's really about the training and the culture. You talked about culture, but the culture is based on the talent you have and the opportunity for training that next generation of...
all of you have talked about the importance of talent, but I also hear the next step, which is, because you're not as a leader going to be telling people this is what you're producing, this is what you're doing, you have to create some degree of vision and guardrails and sense of purpose that help them make the decisions they have to make along the way.
Well, and it's not just who you're able to attract, being attractive and open and being a talent magnet and whatever, or even having integrated and multidisciplinary, cognitively diverse teams. It's leading and managing them well. Diverse teams, well managed, produce superior outcomes. Diverse teams poorly managed produce average or worse outcomes. So it's the magic is in how you're leading the teams, and the notion of, am I producing a set engineering or design or concrete outcome, or is it something where we've got a solution in mind and we have collective, maybe different incentives for how we're managing that. It's just a different way of managing that talent. So it's not just the fact of the talent, but really how you're getting them to work in a more iterative way. It's kind of the way I'd describe it.
Tom Siebel, who started Siebel Systems, he's been in this business for 4 or 5 decades now, I guess, wrote a book recently in which he said that the thing that distinguishes the current wave of technology from previous waves of technology is that to be successful, it has to be driven from the top. It's not something you can say to your CTO or your CIO, go out and implement this, because it has such far-reaching impact. Do you think that's correct?
I think that CEOs, CIOs, C-suites as teams are under enormous pressure. They have got to deliver today's business and earnings schedule on time and in full, if not a little early, thank you very much. You've got to radically transform your business with a lot of digital and analytic capabilities that are still, in some cases, emerging and on a much faster cycle. You've got a huge amount of transparency, volatility, geopolitics playing into your business. You've got higher expectations for ethical decision making that you can speak to transparently and drive in the decision making. And CEO tenures are shortening. Management tenures are shortening, not lengthening. And so it is much more integrated into the total transformation of the business. The trick is, how do you deliver what you've got today and then build something of adequate scale that allows your multiple stakeholders, including your investors, to believe that the economics as well as the other benefits and outcomes are going to be delivered. And that is it's a very, very difficult balance for leaders today.
You know, the opportunity and the challenge of performing while you transform is one of the most difficult things anybody faces. You have to be able to manage that. You have to be able to make the bets that are going to have short-term impact, that are going to, obviously, and it's pretty generic, but are going to ensure that long-term success of whatever that North Star is that you're trying to get to. But changing the tires while the car is moving is probably the most difficult thing.
Which is what everyone is doing.
Which everyone has to do right now.
What do you think about the role of the person at the top?
I think that, well, I would articulate it more this way. I think that to truly have impact with technology, you can't implement technology in your current frame, or that's automation, you can create value with that. So you have to be thinking about, how am I creating a new source of advantage or a capability that leads to a new source of advantage? Often that comes from the top, but I wouldn't want to limit it. I think there are really bright people who see an opportunity to change their relative position in a marketplace by leveraging technology that might be 5 levels down in an organization. But I think what he was trying to say, and it's simplistic to say come from the top, is it can't just be about in the current frame of what we're doing. That's automation, and we've all been doing that for a long time. It really needs to be, how am I building a new capability? How am I building a new business? How am I building a new market? And leveraging technology to do it, which without that technology I couldn't do.
I mean, I would think that's one of, from people I've talked to, that is one of the big things that distinguishes, it gets back to your point about what's the value proposition. The things that distinguishes successful applications from unsuccessful applications. Are you just trying to use technology to replace some process that's already in place? You know, can I do it more efficiently? Can I save some money by doing this? Or are you using the potential of this current wave of technology to completely rethink the value process, how you do everything?
And the end-to-end transformations that we've seen, or the end-to-end ability to both deliver today's business and build a significantly, and I mean an at-scale new one, we talk about 20%, 30%, 40% of your profits, having a radical new incorporated goal in terms of contributing something back to society or innovations that you apply in different sectors, it is very clear that teams that aren't successful, sometimes make mistakes that you made in the analog world. Number one is famine. You just starve the projects and initiatives. You don't invest enough
The new business.
to actually scale the new business fast enough to be creative about the problem solving and what you're going to do. It doesn't mean that you are necessarily 100% sure it's going to work, but if you don't invest enough, you can't sort of do it on the cheap or starve, or what did they say, feed a fever, starve a cold, feed a fever, I can't remember.
And that just, that happens.
I always get it wrong. I'm constantly.
Well, you're pretty healthy. But my point is the basics of underinvesting in a new strategic platform is a mistake that business leaders make often, and it's no different just because it's technology.
And that happens because the incumbents are sitting around the table and they sort of they tend to get first dibs, and it makes it harder to give the resources to the new business, right?
Yeah, well, there are lots of reasons, but I think the notion of not being able to imagine clear enough what the value proposition is, and then you sort of back end the investment from that. So let's call that famine. You have pestilence as well, which is another, and that we refer to as lots of projects and pilots and things that you scale. And sometimes you might have a very bright, shiny object, an at-scale application, but that's not the scale enough to actually transform the business. It's exciting, it's new, it might capture people's attention, it might even be needed, but it's not material enough if you think about what's happening in your broader P&L, the broader business exchange that's happening. And so those two are for sure challenges. The third, staying with the analogy of four horsemen, is a war. Organization silos, people not getting along, not cooperating, competing, that lack of collaboration that prevents the kind of working Jim was talking about. And then the final thing is the value proposition, not having a living model, or death, as one of my colleagues likes to call it. And so we use a little bit of humor of the four horsemen of famine, pestilence, war, and death, so it's memorable. But the point is, those are mistakes we were making sometimes as managers before we had analytic and digital technology. It's just about making the clear decisions and not letting the technology confuse or complicate it.
We're seeing it play out most currently in the entertainment industry. If you think about the entertainment industry having to transform in the direct-to-consumer market and taking those legacy models and literally changing as we go, and Disney is a great example. Yes, they made the bet, and yes, they launched Disney Plus, and they made the decision to pull content back from Netflix. Those are big decisions you're making, because you're creating starvation over here where you're losing X billions of dollars of licensing revenue, but you're making the bet on where you have to go. And we're watching each one of these entertainment companies go through that.
Who's doing it the best?
Well, you can't argue with 12 and 13 million subscribers in a week that, yes, there was a technological glitch, but so what? At the end of the day, I think they will, I think they come out in the lead. So I think right now, we don't know. The spring will tell us what happens with Comcast, what happens with Warner, what happens with others who are making this same move. But you're watching it happen right now, changing the marketing muscle and changing the entire business model to go direct to consumer over the top.
Did you want to add to that?
I think one of the big issues, I think it's not only are people willing to take big bets, it is, can they open their aperture enough to be creative enough to think about how technology might radically transform a business? I mean, we are all so used to living in a world of incremental improvement. So, take a simple one, a car, right? We all can imagine working at an automaker and thinking about how you take 2, 3, 4% out of the cost per year. Of course, when you back up and say the average car is used 90 minutes a day, if I could figure out how to use it for 3 hours, well, that's worth a 50% reduction, right? In our context, we spend so much time thinking about things like developer productivity, where to back up and open your aperture and say, how can I apply AI to the developer and what a developer does, which is a very creative thing. We are experimenting around with some pretty cool technologies that can double, triple developer productivity.
It requires a degree. It requires a degree of creativity that you don't always find in business C-suites. Yeah. I want to go back to your true north point, because as somebody who's been covering businesses and business leaders for 4 decades, there's something really fundamental that has changed in the last few years. You have people who run large organizations talking about values issues, speaking out. And Mark Benioff was one of the first when he came out against the religious liberties law in Indiana 5 years ago, a law that really didn't have a lot directly to do with his bottom line, but he felt he needed to take a stand. Bank of America did something similar over the transgender access to bathrooms laws. You've seen a number of, think of Delta Airlines in the state of Georgia, had a tax bill before the Georgia legislature whose members are mostly members of the NRA, but they came out and took away their discount program for the NRA. And I've found, really in the last 3 or 4 years, for the first time, corporate leaders talking about moral leadership, which was not something that was in the conversation 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. How do those value issues play in to digital transformation?
Well, I'll start. And there are multiple levels in terms of workforce and trying to attract workforce. But I think probably the most fundamental issue here is that the nature of work has changed. Again, when you go from doing a set of prescribed tasks, there is a phenomenal amount of academic research that says you pay people more, they will work faster. There's also a phenomenal amount of academic research which says when people are doing creative tasks, more money actually makes them less creative because it narrows your mind. But what we do know is purpose and meaning go a long way to get people to really become more creative, to spend more time in the shower thinking about ideas, et cetera, et cetera. So again, when the content of work changes, and technology does that because we're automating the rote tasks, how you motivate, how you inspire people becomes much, much, much more important and less about the money and more about meaning. So I certainly think we're all in a war for talent, and so people want to work at a place with meaning. But literally, I think down to the work content, if people feel inspired by the mission of the company and what it's doing,
they'll be more creative.
They will be more creative. Per hour, you get more output.
But the ethical visibility that you talked about, or transparency, I mean, that is front and center today. And I think consumers and workforce are looking at it through the lens of don't read my lips, watch my feet. It's not just what I'm saying, it's what I'm doing. How am I conducting myself as a business in the world? And am I doing those things in line with what I've said my purpose is? Because purpose is now the new buzzword and everybody's talking about it, but is everybody actually talking about it, admiring it, or doing it?
Right.
And the data backs up the position because we know, and you've done so much work yourself and debate around long-term capitalism, that one of the biggest characteristics for companies that explicitly have multiple stakeholders, multiple goals, that they also have, and it needs to be reflected in everything as concrete as your investor mix all the way through to your stated business objectives, that having a midterm and long-term perspective is correlated very positively with better returns. And it's not just about being patient for those returns, it's having a more holistic definition of what you're solving for. We define it a little bit as, or describe it, I should say, a little bit as being more like a modern 21st century company is going to be one where the notion of what is our holistic purpose and clarity around that. And we're getting a little bit of help because the rigor with which the SDGs have been developed and the way in which you can think about applying those at scale. And we'll take an example of Dave Lewis at Tesco, who's been a real leader on the concept of food waste and the application in their chains, but also I'm sure, very sure, applying it in real granularity to his own business as a market leader, competing with really thin margins in grocery. And so this notion, Salesforce, obviously a great example in and of its own right. Payments companies who are, building really economic competitive products in the developing world, but offering mobiles and literally people who are unbankable with no access in places like Mexico, Kenya, inner cities, can use those payment platforms to really innovate. So I think you've got to not admire the problem or not admire the ambition, let me put it that way, and get concrete about what does it actually mean for our business. Pick one or two areas that are real for your investors, real for your employees, real for your customers, and then do the hard work, which will be over 3 or 4 years, 4 or 5 years, to actually then embed that so that, your people believe you, your customers believe you, and you see the returns.
I want to open it up for people, any questions that people may have in the audience. Can we do that? Do we have some mic runners out there?
We have a lot of big voices. People can just speak.
All right. Well, if you do,
are.
raise your hand. I have lots to talk about. But let me, Michael, what's the role of the board in this? I was in a conversation last week with 30 people who sit on boards, and some really interesting comments came out about the role that the board needs to play in transformation.
Well, obviously, they need to be aligned. Boards are in the role of helping run companies, and so I think you need that alignment. You have to make sure the North Star is there, but I think it comes back to the issue of who sits around that board table in a proverbial way. We do a lot of discussion in this industry and spend a lot of time on diversity and inclusion, and we're looking at that, and we know that those companies that are more advanced in that regard, we heard it this morning from President Obama, but we hear it every day in the real world, and not that that wasn't the real world. In fact, I wish it was. Sorry, but sorry.
This is not a political panel.
I understand. I understand, but one can hope. The truth is, the makeup of that boardroom is what really matters, and I do believe you need people who, and I know this is a good debate because we chatted about it in the green room, Alan. You need people around that table who understand that journey and understand the steps you need to take, and too many boards are filled with, and I'm a reformed lawyer, so I can say this, but are filled with lawyers and folks that don't have the experience in transformation, in the journey, what it takes. So not only should we be looking at diversity and inclusion from gender and ethnicity and everything else that we know the importance of, but we should look at it from the skill set and having those people around the table. So I think, the board makes a big difference, and I think the makeup of that board is what can ensure the success and the support for the C-suite to deliver on those needs.
Jim, you were talking earlier about culture and the importance of culture. You have to be living through one of the great experiments in culture of all times right now with Red Hat being acquired by IBM, which I suspect has a very different culture from the one at Red Hat.
That's safe to say.
Can you talk a little bit about merging different cultures? Because I suspect many people in this group have been through similar experiences.
Yeah, so, we are very proactively working to keep separation, and let me just spend a minute teasing that out. And what we're saying it is two cultures working together, not coming together. And the observation around culture we talked about a little bit earlier is there are cultures that are more likely to generate a greater set of innovation. There are cultures, I used to be at Delta Airlines, a great company, very different culture than Red Hat. It runs a very effective airline with a very different culture that's more working towards driving compliance and relative to innovation. And so the thing we've really focused on with Red Hat and IBM is not one's better, one's worse. They're different. IBM runs the most mission critical, systems in the world, right? They are a systemic financial risk because of the mainframe and what they do. If you put Red Hat's culture on top of IBM, that would be a problem. At the same time, if you put IBM's culture on top of Red Hat and how we innovate and what we do broadly in communities, that would be a problem. So what we've really focused on is saying it's two cultures that are different but complementary. The cultures lead to, we're solving different problems, and so it is okay if we're different, and there's not better or worse. They are different for good reason. I think the key is, but we said, is kind of cultures and output. It's, okay, well, let's roll that back. Why does our management system, why does our planning process, why does our incentive comp system, why does our management cadence and how we hold people accountable look different than IBM's? Well, those different things manifest themselves ultimately in different cultures because they're what's rewarded. And so, we have a lot of talk about, hey, let's share learnings on how we do leadership development and how IBM does because we can learn from each other. But we're not combining them because a Red Hat leader at its optimal is going to look different than an IBM leader at its optimal, and that's okay.
But you were talking about the interaction between a compliance culture and an innovation culture. I mean, can you go a little bit deeper into that? Because part of digital transformation is companies are trying to become more innovative. Does that necessarily mean that they have to pull back on the compliance culture?
I would say compliance is a tough word because compliance has a set of legal meanings, and I think we are highly compliant at Red Hat against a whole set of financial accounting, et cetera. It does mean that you're giving up direct control for a degree of indirect control. So, and I saw this, going from Delta to Red Hat was probably about as extreme as you can get. You have to recognize my job is no longer specify what people are going to do and then hold them accountable for that. And so yes, to some extent you give up control because I can't look exactly and know where things are and look week to week and see how we're doing against a set of implementation steps in the way I could at Delta. So yeah, to some extent you give up control. We think more in terms of portfolio. I have a number of things going on. We're going to call things over time. It's more about setting guardrails, which you either use values and actual management systems around it, but you give people more latitude to go off and do things. So as a leader, it feels like I'm giving up a lot of control, but in the end, it's a control over process steps, not necessarily outcomes. And so it's a different way to lead where, I'm still the CEO, I can still say yes and no to things, but how it actually runs fundamentally feels different. So it's, a little bit like if you're driving a car that has, great grip, four-wheel drive, you make a turn, it's going to turn exactly how you want to, versus like driving a boat, and it's a little more gradual with how you get things to happen. You're still in control, but you're not quite as in tight control. And so that's one of the things that makes leaders uneasy when you're going from one to the other. And it's recognized you still have control, but it's a different level of control and a different type of control to ultimately try to get the result you're looking for.
It's interesting. I take an analogy from the healthcare industry, which obviously, if you think about research and development processes and animal and human experiment trials, et cetera, you need to have, just like flying an airplane, a high degree of compliance, health, safety, et cetera. So it depends on what's at stake when you talk about the trade-off on compliance is. But the pharmaceutical and medical products industry has gone from 20 years ago, 5% external syndicated research and development, in 95 or 90% internal, to almost the inverse. In a way where they were managing a huge array of partners and distributed networks, getting into really disaggregating the analytics even within types of biology, chemistry, et cetera, by therapy areas, getting out of smaller, highly complex, sometimes more rare disease areas, but then you see these amazing ecosystems of startups come in and solve the problems in new, totally unforeseen ways, and then those companies with capital investing back in them. But we're still getting really safe products into clinical trials, hopefully faster and with better outcomes, and including more rare disease and more specific diseases with the fabulous genetic material we have. So it's an example of where compliance or control matters hugely. We're dealing with, real science.
You have to create the ability to innovate within that.
Well, and use the technologies we have to solve the issues where control, compliance are needed. It can be part of the solution. It's not always just a barrier or a problem.
Are you talking external control and compliance or internal control and compliance?
Both, because there are things, it's like a Venn diagram. There are things that technologists know and understand about the world around them that, almost like a good steward or a parent of a family, that the architects, many of whom are in this room or managed by folks in this room, are going to have to solve for us. The average consumer is never going to really know how their mobile works. They just know whether it's a satisfying experience that I'm willing to pay value into.
But Alan, you're on a really important point here, because I think so much people look and say, I'm going to take a directive top-down leader, I'm going to put them in jeans, put them in a cube and open floor plans and give everybody free snacks, and somehow the culture's going to change, right? It's not, it really is. It's about leaders recognizing how you lead has to change in an environment, and it does require seeding control.
We do have a question right here. If we can bring can you bring the microphone out here quickly, or do you just want to speak loudly?
I can speak loudly. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
So you were talking about the culture of your organization, and my question to you, with an equitable lens, what efforts are you making to your organizations to bring in individuals that are in marginalized communities that may not have the capacity or the exposure to be engaged in your company?
So the importance of bringing in people from marginalized communities to be part of that talent pool?
Well, I mean, we can each answer from our own perspective. So we have a whole series of programs where we're working with high schools, with IBM especially, and we're now able to leverage their programs and scale. We adopt high schools. It's called P-Tech, and we look to bring people starting in high school and over a 5 to 6 year period go through high school and a college degree, and a promise of a job in the company. I think the P-Tech program's been an extraordinary way that we're bringing, and we pick high schools. We work with school districts to pick high schools very much in at-risk communities, very specifically to do that. Ginny Rometty started that, and I think it's an incredible program that we're now deeply involved in. I think really deeply, it's not just let's give some money or let's go run a program. It is a long-term commitment to these schools, so it's not just one class coming through. So there's a class every year through 6 years with a job out the other side. And it's been amazing to talk to some of I'm going to sound old now, some of the kids who are now working at IBM who've come through that program, how impactful that is. It's impactful not only because it's a good thing to do in the communities, but we talk about creating the context for people to do their best work. Well, part of context is creating the right level of diversity in an organization. There's, again, been just so much work. Diverse groups make better decisions, are more creative. And so recognizing that and making that a core part of what you mean. If your management system, it's creating context, then creating the appropriate level of diversity and the right tone around that becomes incredibly important.
We have another question right here up front. Yeah, he's got a microphone coming to you.
Current leaders are often incentivized to act like they have done over the past years or decade. So what do you think, how do incentive schemes need to change and KPIs by which people are measured to actually facilitate that change and enable them to go the more uneasy route?
Great question, Dame Vivian. I love saying that, by the way. Dame Vivian.
It kind of rolls off the tongue.
It does, yeah. I've never known a dame before. It's really quite and Dame Vivian.
Well, exactly. Now that we have Jane Ann at Salesforce, you know too. 2 or 3 things. One is individual incentives, clarity about what you're trying to deliver and making sure people are motivated to do that, but it's not individual alone. Collective and team incentives that certainly at a number of clients that are, whether it's project-based or let me call it more business or a larger ambition for the company, a shared objective around that is also something that we increasingly see. And it literally is going from high pressure, high risk output delivery. I take a talented individual, put them into pressure and hope that they perform, to an individual incentive might be a third or less of your incentive. You have a significant portion on the team-based outcome, which could be collective objectives across different areas. We were talking about marketing and tech in the green room beforehand. And then the final thing is, I would say, accountability, real clarity, including most high-skilled people are motivated by recognition and acknowledgement just as much as they are by financial reward.
Yeah, I would go back to use Disney as a great example. If you listen to their earnings announcements recently, they suffered some short-term declination in profitability because of the bet they're making here in direct-to-consumer. I don't think Bob Iger has suffered in his pay packet.
Doesn't appear to have.
Yeah, I mean, just saying, but that's an exception. But to your point, how do you do that in the real world where somebody's still going to be judged by the profitability?
Jim, we've got 16 seconds left. What's your final piece of advice to all these people undertaking?
Well, I'll quickly on that say, I pay everybody the same. There's almost no difference. We're all one team. We get paid together, and it's almost all long-term, and so we can figure it out. My big advice is, again, as a leader, all of you are leaders, your job is to create the context for people to do their best work. It's not to direct. It's not. People will, if you have a good team, they'll figure out how to do it, and if not, change members of your team. If you think of your role as that as a leader, what you do with technology, you will be successful.
That's great. Thank you, all 3 of you. Very useful panel.